My hands would not stop shaking. I sat in the third row of Lecture Hall 17, aboard the Galactic Collegium of Interspecies Sciences, staring at the biological chart floating above the podium, and I told myself the data was wrong. It had to be wrong. I had checked it 3 times. I had requested a secondary source verification from the Collegium's central archive. I had run the numbers through 2 separate analytical models built for cross-species hormonal comparison. The numbers had not changed, not by a fraction. The chart showed the hormonal profile of the adult human male across a standard orbital year. I understood endocrine mapping. I had built my entire graduate career in reproductive chronobiology, which is the science of when and how species reproduce according to their biological clocks. I was Selvari. My people follow a strict 40-day fertility window once every 3 orbital years. Outside that window, the biological drive simply does not exist. It switches off like a circuit closing. Clean, predictable, efficient. Every sapient species in the cataloged galaxy follows some version of this pattern. The Drothkari experience a 72-hour frenzy once per decade. The Fenathi have an annual event so intense it renders their males temporarily catatonic outside the active period. The Gorvathi lock into a 6-month bonding cycle that requires environmental triggers from their home star's radiation output. Every species has a window. Every species has an off switch. I was looking at a chart that did not have one. Professor Darren Hale stood behind the podium with his arms loosely crossed, watching our faces with the kind of calm patience that always made me feel like he knew something I did not. He was human, mid-30s by their reckoning, which placed him at roughly the midpoint of his expected lifespan. He was the only human faculty member at the Collegium, recruited 12 years ago when humanity made formal contact with the Galactic Council. He taught every course related to human biology with a dry, measured humor that I found deeply unsettling, because it always seemed to be hiding something enormous behind something small. Today's lecture was on the human male reproductive system. He had spent the previous 3 weeks building through endocrinology, layer by careful layer, and I had followed every step with the confidence of a researcher who knew exactly what she was looking for. I was looking for the spike, the seasonal hormonal surge, the trigger point that would mark the opening of the mating window. I was going to identify it, map its duration and intensity, compare it against the galactic baseline of 412 catalog species, and write a clean, efficient chapter of my dissertation. The line on the chart was flat. Not perfectly flat. There were minor daily fluctuations, tiny variations that any competent biologist would recognize as standard metabolic noise. But there was no spike, no surge, no window, no crescendo followed by dormancy. The testosterone levels of the human male held steady across every single day of every single month of every single year, from one end of the chart to the other, without interruption, without pause, without any sign of seasonal regulation whatsoever. I raised my hand. My fingers were trembling. Professor Hale pointed at me. Kylara. Professor. I kept my voice steady through an act of will that cost me more than I would ever admit to my classmates. The chart appears to show a constant hormonal baseline with no seasonal reproductive trigger. Can you indicate which portion of the annual cycle represents the active mating period? He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the chart. Then he looked back at me with an expression I had never been able to properly categorize in 12 weeks of study. It was not pity. It was not amusement. It was something closer to the look a doctor gives you before delivering a diagnosis that will reorganize your understanding of your own body. There isn't one, he said. The lecture hall went silent, not the ordinary silence of students processing information, but the airless, ringing silence of 43 sapient beings from 9 different species, simultaneously failing to comprehend a single sentence. I'm sorry, I said. Could you clarify? Human males don't have a mating season. He said it the way someone might say the sky is blue or water is wet, as if it were the most ordinary fact in the universe. We don't have a fertility window. We don't have a dormancy period. We don't cycle on and off. Human males are reproductively active from puberty, which typically occurs around age 12 or 13, until biological death, which can be 80, 90, sometimes over 100 years. Every day, Year-round. No off switch. Behind me, something clattered. I did not turn around, but I knew from the sound that it was Dren, the Drothkari exchange student who sat in the 5th row. He had dropped his datapad. Given that the Drothkari reproduce in a 72-hour frenzy once every 10 years, and spend the remaining decade in complete hormonal dormancy, I understood why his motor coordination might have failed him. "That is not possible," said Valeth, a Fenathi doctoral candidate sitting 2 seats to my left. His vocal harmonics had shifted into the upper distress register. "The metabolic cost alone would be prohibitive. Continuous gamete production requires enormous caloric and mineral resources. No species can sustain that, while also maintaining the neural complexity required for higher cognition. The energy budget does not balance." Professor Hale nodded, as if Valeth had made a reasonable point about the weather. "And yet," he said, and gestured at the chart. "Is this a translation error?" asked Cirith, a quiet Morinai student who rarely spoke. Her species reproduced once in their lifetime through a carefully orchestrated chemical exchange that took 11 months of preparation. Perhaps the term mating season does not translate correctly into your language. "It translates fine," Hale said. "We understand the concept, we just don't have one." I watched a biomonitor on the wrist of the student beside me begin flashing amber, flagging an involuntary stress response. Across the room, Dren was still staring at the floor where his datapad had fallen, making no move to pick it up. Valeth's distress harmonics had not settled. 3 other students were exchanging rapid glances in the visual shorthand of species that had never needed words to express the feeling of the ground shifting beneath them. Professor Hale let the silence hold for exactly long enough, then said, "We'll pick this up next session. I'll be in my office for the next 2 hours if anyone has questions." The class emptied in a kind of stunned, shuffling quiet. I did not leave. I sat in my chair until the room was empty, then I stood up and walked to the podium on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. Professor Hale. He was packing his teaching materials into a battered leather case. Leather, made from animal skin. Humans used the skin of dead animals as carrying accessories. I had known this for months, and it still made my scales tighten. "Kylara, I figured you'd stay." "There must be a dormancy trigger I'm missing," I said. "Environmental, dietary, social, something that modulates the reproductive drive even if it doesn't fully suppress it. Perhaps temperature-dependent hormonal variation or a photosensitive response to stellar radiation cycles on their homeworld." "No. Nutritional gatekeeping then. A caloric threshold below which the system downregulates. Starvation will reduce fertility over time. Sure, but that's not a season. That's just the body running out of fuel. A well-fed human male produces roughly 12 million reproductive cells per hour. Every hour. From puberty to death. That's not a typo. Per hour." I opened my mouth, closed it, and opened it again. 12 million, I repeated. "Per hour," he confirmed. "Give or take." I felt something cold settle in the base of my spine, which is where Selvari process shock before it reaches the brain. "Professor Hale, my species produces a single clutch of reproductive cells once every 3 years, during a biologically mandated window that our entire civilization has been organized around for 40,000 years. You are telling me that a human male produces more reproductive material in a single afternoon than a Selvari female produces in her entire lifetime." "I haven't done that exact math," he said, "but it sounds about right." I gripped the edge of the podium. "How do you function?" "What do you mean?" "How do you function? How do you build civilizations? How do you develop science and art and governance when your biology is running a continuous reproductive program, with no pause and no reset? Every species I have ever studied enters a dormancy period, specifically so that higher cognitive functions can operate without the interference of reproductive hormones. You are telling me humans never get that break?" Hale leaned against the wall and tilted his head. "You know what dating is?" "I have encountered the term. A social ritual related to mate selection." "It's more than that. Dating exists because we needed social frameworks to manage the fact that we're always available. There's no biological timer telling us when to pair up, so we built cultural systems around it instead. Courtship rituals, social norms, relationship structures, all of it constructed because our biology doesn't provide a schedule. We had to invent one. I stared at him. You built your entire social architecture around the absence of a biological clock. We built a lot of things around that absence, he said, and for the first time I heard something in his voice that was not amusement. It was something older, something that sounded almost like pride. I returned to my quarters that night and pulled up every database I had access to through the Collegium's academic network. I cross-referenced human reproductive biology against 412 species profiles. I ran deviation analyses. I built probability models. I searched for any precedent, any parallel, any other species anywhere in the cataloged galaxy that exhibited year-round reproductive capability without seasonal modulation. There were none. Humanity stood alone. At the bottom of my search results, buried in a secondary archive that had not been accessed in over a decade, I found a footnote. It was in a Grenethy first contact debrief from 11 years earlier, filed by a xenobiologist named Tarith Vaughn who had been part of the initial assessment team sent to evaluate humanity after formal contact. The footnote had been flagged by the archive's automated review system and tagged with a single notation, probable translation error, recommend disregard. The footnote read, "The humans claim to have no reproductive season. Recommend reclassification of this species as biologically anomalous. Further study urgently required." Nobody had followed up. For 11 years, that footnote had sat in a dusty corner of a forgotten database, dismissed as a mistake, while humanity quietly integrated into galactic society, and nobody thought to ask the most basic question a xenobiologist could ask about a new species. I closed the database. I sat in the dark of my quarters and listened to the hum of the Collegium's life support systems, and I thought about what it meant that an entire galaxy had looked at the most biologically unique species it had ever encountered, and decided that the data must be wrong because it was too strange to be true. Then I opened a new file on my research terminal and began writing. I did not stop until the station's artificial dawn cycle brightened my windows 6 hours later. The data was not wrong. The galaxy simply was not ready for it. But it was going to have to be. I was standing outside Professor Hale's office at 6 in the morning, 4 hours before his first scheduled class, holding a datapad loaded with 147 questions. He opened the door in a rumpled shirt with a cup of something dark and steaming in his hand. He looked at me, looked at the datapad, and stepped aside without a word. This was one of the things about humans that I had not yet learned to interpret. They made decisions about other people with a speed that bordered on reckless. He did not ask why I was there. He did not check whether I had an appointment. He simply saw me, assessed the situation, and decided in less than 2 seconds that I was welcome. By Selvari standards, that kind of social calculation should take a minimum of 3 exchanges and a formal request filed through appropriate channels. "Coffee?" he asked. "I don't know what that is." "It's a drink made from roasted seeds that we use to override our body's desire to sleep." "You have a drink that overrides biological imperatives?" "Several," he said. "Sit down." I sat. He sat across from me. I launched into my first question, and what followed was the single most disturbing conversation of my academic career. I had come prepared to discuss human male biology. What I had not prepared for was human female biology, which Hale introduced within the first 10 minutes, and which nearly broke me. "Human females," he said, taking a sip of his override drink, "operate on a monthly fertility cycle." I waited for the qualifier. The exception. The context that would make this sentence make sense within any known biological framework. "Monthly," I repeated. "Approximately every 28 days. The body prepares for potential fertilization, and if fertilization doesn't occur, the cycle resets and begins again." I did the math. I did it 3 times, because the first 2 times I was certain I had made an error. That is approximately 12 fertility windows per year. Give or take. Professor Hale, a Selvari female experiences 1 fertility window every 3 years. That is roughly 1/3 of a window per year. You are telling me that a human female has 36 times more opportunities for reproduction annually than a Selvari female. In a single human decade, a human female has more fertility windows than a Selvari female has in her entire reproductive lifespan. I suppose that's right. And during these monthly windows, are human females incapacitated? Do they enter a reduced function state to conserve energy for the reproductive process? He almost laughed. I could see him suppress it, which I appreciated, because I was not sure I could have handled being laughed at in that moment. No, he said. Human females during their cycle continue to work, study, exercise, lead organizations, fly spacecraft, perform surgery, argue in courts of law, and do everything else they normally do. Some experience discomfort, some don't notice it at all. Many go through their entire monthly cycle without any significant disruption to their daily activities. I set my datapad down on his desk because my hands were shaking again, and I did not want him to see. Every species I have ever studied enters a reduced function state during reproductive activity. The biological cost is too high to sustain normal operations simultaneously. You are telling me that human females pay that cost every month and simply absorb it while continuing to function at full capacity. I'm telling you that human females have been doing this for about 200,000 years and built civilizations while doing it. I picked my datapad back up because writing notes gave my hands something to do besides tremble. Let us move on. I need to understand the relationship between fertility and desire in humans. This was the part that fundamentally altered my understanding of biology as a science. In every species I had studied, desire was a product of the mating season. It arrived when the hormonal window opened, it drove behavior toward reproduction, and it faded when the window closed. The mechanism was clean and efficient. You wanted to reproduce when your body was ready to reproduce, and you did not want to reproduce when your body was not ready. The link between fertility and desire was absolute and unbreakable. In humans, Hale said, with the measured tone of someone explaining something he had explained many times and knew would cause damage every time. Desire and fertility are separate systems. I stopped writing. What do you mean separate? I mean humans experience attraction, romantic attachment, and physical desire, regardless of whether reproduction is biologically possible at that moment. A human can want to be with someone on any day, at any time, for reasons that have nothing to do with making offspring. In fact, most of the time, reproduction is not the goal at all. That is not how biology works, I said, and even as I said it, I knew it was a foolish thing to say to a human about humans. It's how human biology works. We feel desire because of emotional bonding, physical attraction, intellectual connection, shared experience, humor, stress, celebration, comfort-seeking, loneliness, curiosity, and about 100 other triggers that have nothing to do with a fertility calendar. Many humans actively prevent reproduction while still engaging in all the bonding behaviors associated with it. They prevent reproduction while still bonding? Extensively. Humans developed entire industries around preventing reproduction, specifically so they could continue bonding without the consequence. It's one of our bigger economic sectors. I stared at him. He took another sip of his override drink. Professor Hale, in the Selvari reproductive model, bonding is a function of the season. When the window opens, two individuals feel drawn together by chemical imperative, they fulfill the biological mandate, and the bond fades when the window closes. The bond is not chosen, it is assigned by hormonal compatibility. Are you telling me that humans choose their mates? Every time. Based on what criteria? Emotion, experience, shared values, attraction, compatibility, trust. Sometimes shared humor, sometimes just proximity and timing. It varies enormously between individuals and cultures and historical periods. There is no single algorithm, and they can change their selection? Frequently. They can bond, dissolve the bond, and form a new bond? Yes, some bond for life, some bond multiple times, some bond briefly, some bond deeply with one person and maintain lighter bonds with many others simultaneously. The flexibility is almost unlimited. I put my datapad down again. This time it was not because my hands were shaking. It was because I needed both hands to press against my temples while I reorganized every assumption I had ever made about the biological basis of social structure. Professor Hale, what you are describing is not a reproductive strategy. It is an emotional architecture. Your species did not build social structures around mating windows because you do not have mating windows. You built social structures around feelings, around choice, around a constant, unbroken current of emotional energy that never shuts off. He pointed at me with his cup. Now you're getting it. I spent the next 6 hours in the Collegium's cultural archive, pulling human data with a focus I had never applied to any research subject. What I found did not calm me down. I started with music, because music is one of the most reliable indicators of what a species considers emotionally important. The Drothkari have mating chants, a collection of approximately 300 ritual songs performed exclusively during their 72-hour reproductive window. The Fenathi have seasonal harmonics, a library of perhaps 500 compositions tied to their annual cycle. The Selvari have bonding hymns, fewer than 200, all performed within the 40-day window, and then stored away until the next season. Humans had millions of songs. Not hundreds, not thousands. Millions, spanning recorded history back thousands of years, across hundreds of cultures and languages and continents, an unbroken river of musical expression, devoted almost entirely to the experience of wanting someone, losing someone, finding someone, missing someone, choosing someone, being chosen, being rejected, trying again, and wanting again. Love songs, longing songs, heartbreak songs, celebration songs. An entire species had been singing about the same emotional experience for millennia, and had never once run out of things to say about it because the feeling never stopped. I listened to a human song that was over 400 years old. It was simple, a voice and a stringed instrument. The words were about missing someone who was far away. It had been recorded in a language that was no longer widely spoken, and it still made something tighten behind my sternum that I did not have a name for. I moved to literature and found the same pattern. Thousands of years of written records, and a staggering proportion of them dealt with love, loss, desire, jealousy, devotion, betrayal, reunion, and the infinite complexity of chosen bonds. Humans had entire artistic traditions, entire philosophical schools, entire legal systems built around the consequences of year-round emotional availability. They had a concept called heartbreak, which was not a medical condition, but a metaphorical description of the pain caused by a dissolved bond, and they had been writing about it since before they had developed spaceflight. No other species in the galaxy had anything like this, because no other species needed it. When your bonding drive turns off at the end of the season, there is no heartbreak, there is no longing. There is no art born from the ache of wanting someone you cannot have, because outside the window, you simply do not want. The drive evaporates, and you return to your baseline, and you get on with your life until the next cycle begins. Humans never returned to baseline. There was no baseline to return to. The wanting was the baseline. I contacted my doctoral advisor, Professor Wren, via subspace relay that evening. She was on the Selvari homeworld, 3 transit jumps away, and the connection was grainy with distance. I told her what I had found. I showed her the data. I walked her through the hormonal profiles, the cultural evidence, the sheer mathematical impossibility of a species that produced millions of songs about a single emotional state. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "There must be a dormancy period you have not identified." "There isn't one. Kailara, the metabolic cost of what you are describing would be unsustainable. A species cannot maintain continuous reproductive capacity, and continuous emotional bonding, and continuous higher cognition simultaneously. The energy budget does not permit it. Professor Wren, their homeworld is classified as a Category 12 death world." That stopped her. I watched her process the connection that I had been assembling in my own mind for the past 12 hours. A death world. A planet where the gravity was punishing, the climate was unstable, the predators were relentless, the diseases were adaptive, and extinction was not a theoretical risk, but an active, daily threat, pressing against every living thing from every direction at once. On a world like that, a species that could only reproduce during a brief seasonal window would be devastatingly vulnerable. One bad season, one catastrophic event during the window, and the entire next generation would be lost. But a species that could reproduce at any time, that carried the drive and the capability and the emotional bonding infrastructure every single day of every single year, that species could take a hit during any season and recover, because there would always be another chance. Tomorrow, next week, next month. The window never closed, because on a death world, a closed window was a death sentence. The constant drive is not a flaw, I said. It is the ultimate survival adaptation. They evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day, and they responded by becoming a species that could create the next generation on any day. The bonding never stops, because on their world, the threat never stopped. They are not biologically excessive. They are biologically optimized for a level of environmental hostility that most species in the galaxy cannot even imagine. Professor Wren was silent for 11 seconds, which by Selvari academic standards was an expression of profound distress. "Kylara," she said, "write everything down, all of it. Do not leave anything out." I closed the connection and walked to the campus commons to think. The space was wide and softly lit, designed for cross-species social interaction, and it was mostly empty at this hour. Mostly. 2 human students were sitting at a table near the far wall. A male and a female. They were leaning toward each other across the table, their voices low, their hands occasionally touching. The female laughed at something the male said, and he smiled in a way that changed the entire geometry of his face. It was the middle of a standard academic cycle. There was no season in effect, no ritual in progress, no pheromone trigger, no hormonal mandate, no biological clock counting down to a window that would open or close. They were just 2 people, drawn together by something I was only beginning to understand, operating on a continuous current of emotional energy that their species had been running on since before they left their caves. I opened my research journal and wrote a single line. Humans do not have a mating season because they turned their entire existence into one. I closed the journal and watched them for a while longer, and I thought about a galaxy full of species that had looked at humanity for 12 years and somehow missed the most extraordinary thing about them. Not their strength, not their adaptability, not their stubbornness, or their creativity, or their unsettling habit of befriending everything that moved. The most extraordinary thing about humans was that they never stopped feeling, and the galaxy had no idea what that meant. But I was beginning to. The Xenobiology Review Board rejected my preliminary thesis draft on a Tuesday. I received the formal notification at exactly 1400 hours, station time. It arrived as a priority academic communication flagged with the board's official seal, which meant 7 senior professors from 6 different species had read my work, discussed it, voted on it, and unanimously decided that I was either wrong or delusional. The rejection letter was 3 pages long, but the core argument fit into a single paragraph. The board considered my findings biologically implausible. Their reasoning was straightforward, and, by the standards of every known model of sapient species development, entirely logical. No sapient species could sustain the metabolic, hormonal, and neurological cost of year-round reproductive capacity while simultaneously maintaining the cognitive function necessary for civilization building. The energy budget did not work. Reproduction was expensive. Intelligence was expensive. Every known model of evolutionary development said a species had to choose between high intelligence with rare and efficient mating cycles or lower cognition with frequent reproduction. Humans, according to my data, had chosen both, and the board's official position was that this was impossible. They recommended I re-examine my methodology for cultural contamination bias, which was academic language, for they thought I had been fooled by the humans into believing their own propaganda about themselves. I sat in my quarters and read the rejection letter 4 times. Then I went to Professor Hale's office and put the letter on his desk. He read it, set it down, and said, "They don't believe you. They think the data is wrong. The data isn't wrong. I know that. You know that. The board does not know that, and they will not accept written data from a graduate student over 4 centuries of established biological modeling." Hale leaned back in his chair. "Then don't give them written data. Show them. Live. In person. Put humans and aliens in the same room and let the biometrics speak for themselves." That was how the Cultural Exchange Observation Study was born, and it was either the best or the worst idea I had ever been involved in? Possibly both. The design was elegant in its simplicity. I would organize a structured social event aboard the Collegium, a casual mixer where alien students and human students could interact in a natural setting. All participants would wear standard-issue biometric monitoring bands that tracked hormonal output, neurological activity, and autonomic responses in real time. The bands were non-invasive and commonly used in xenobiological research, so there was no ethical barrier to their deployment. The hypothesis was clean. Alien participants, who were currently in their species' reproductive dormancy period, would show flat social bonding and attraction metrics during the event. Friendly engagement, yes. Cooperative behavior, certainly. But no bonding hormone activity, because their biology was in its off state. Human participants, regardless of any variable I could identify, would show active bonding engagement across the board because they did not have an off state. If the biometric data confirmed this divergence in a live, observable setting, the board would have to accept it. I spent 2 weeks recruiting volunteers. I secured 12 human participants, including Professor Hale, Lieutenant Mira Vasquez, who was a military attaché visiting the Collegium on a diplomatic rotation, and 10 human students from various departments. I also recruited 26 alien participants from 14 species, all of whom confirmed through medical screening that they were currently in their reproductive dormancy periods. The control group was airtight. Every non-human in that room would be biologically dormant. Every human would be whatever humans were all the time. The event was scheduled for a standard rest cycle afternoon in the Collegium's largest social commons, a wide, open space with comfortable seating, refreshment stations, and enough room for 60 people to move around freely. I had the biometric feeds routed to a monitoring station where I could watch the data in real time, and I had invited 3 members of the review board to observe remotely through secured data links. The participants arrived, mingled, and the event began. Within the first 20 minutes, I understood why the galaxy was not ready for humans. The alien participants behaved exactly as predicted. They were pleasant. They were conversational. They engaged in small talk and collaborative activities with the kind of polite, functional sociability that dormant phase individuals display across every known species. Their biometric data was textbook. Flat bonding hormone output, minimal oxytocin fluctuation, steady, unremarkable neurological baselines. They were awake, present, and emotionally neutral. Exactly what the models predicted. The humans were on fire. Not metaphorically. Their biometric data looked like a series of controlled explosions. Every single human participant, from the moment they walked into the room, showed elevated oxytocin levels, active dopamine fluctuation, heightened social bonding markers, and neurological patterns consistent with deep emotional engagement. They had not been primed. They had not been given stimulants. They had not been briefed on the study's hypothesis. They were simply existing in a room full of other beings, and their biology had immediately and automatically begun the process of connecting with every person around them. I watched a human male student named Colin sit down next to a Morini researcher and begin asking her about her work in stellar cartography. His bonding hormone profile shifted within 90 seconds, not toward the Morini specifically, not in a reproductive sense, but in a broad, diffuse wave of social warmth that spread across his entire neurochemical landscape. He was interested. He was engaged. He was generating the same chemical signatures that a Selvari would only produce during the height of a bonding season, and he was doing it over a casual conversation about star maps with a being from a species he had never met before. I watched Lieutenant Vasquez move through the room like a warm current through cold water. She spoke to everyone. She remembered names after a single introduction. She asked a Drothkari student about his family, and a Fenathi researcher about her recent publication, and a Gorvathi engineer about a technical problem he had mentioned in passing 3 days earlier. Her biometric data was extraordinary. Continuous, elevated, multi-target bonding engagement, with no signs of fatigue, no signs of depletion, no signs that her neurochemistry was drawing down a finite resource. She was not running on a battery. She was running on a generator. The alien participants noticed. I could see it in their body language, the subtle cues that each species used to signal confusion, or discomfort, or something they could not name. The humans were too warm, too attentive, too present. In a room full of dormant phase individuals, operating on polite autopilot, the humans burned like stars, and every alien in the room could feel the heat, even if they could not identify the source. At the 90-minute mark, I had enough data to overturn the board's rejection 10 times over. But the event was not finished, and neither was the data. The incident happened at 1 hour and 47 minutes. It was during a collaborative puzzle exercise, one of several structured activities I had designed to encourage cross-species interaction. Lieutenant Vasquez had been paired with a Drothkari male named Fenor, and they were working on a spatial reasoning challenge that required them to coordinate physical movements to manipulate a holographic construct. They had known each other for approximately 45 minutes. They had exchanged perhaps 200 words. By any reasonable social metric, they were acquaintances at best. A maintenance conduit behind the wall chose that moment to malfunction. A pressure seal failed in the climate regulation system, and a burst of compressed atmospheric gas discharged into the room through a ventilation panel with a sharp, startling hiss. The gas was completely harmless, a standard nitrogen-oxygen mix at slightly elevated pressure. But the sound was sudden and loud, and for approximately 3 seconds, nobody in the room knew what was happening. In those 3 seconds, Lieutenant Vasquez moved. She did not assess the threat. She did not calculate the risk. She did not consult her training, or her rational mind, or any conscious decision-making framework. In the time it took the rest of the room to flinch, Vasquez had stepped between Fentor and the source of the sound, put her body between him and the ventilation panel, pulled him behind a table with one hand, and scanned the room for additional threats, with an intensity that made the muscles in her jaw stand out like cables. The gas discharge stopped. The room settled. People looked around, confused, embarrassed, slightly startled. The moment passed. But I was watching the biometric feeds, and the moment had not passed for Vasquez. Her data showed a massive, instantaneous spike in protective bonding hormones. Not the gradual build of a developing relationship, not the slow accretion of trust over shared experience. A single, explosive neurochemical event that rewired her threat response priorities in under 1 second, to include a Drothkari male she had known for less than an hour. She had bonded with him, not romantically, not reproductively, but protectively, aggressively, and with a chemical intensity that exceeded anything in my comparative database. She had decided, in a fraction of a heartbeat, that Fenor was someone she would protect, and her entire biology had reorganized itself around that decision before her conscious mind had finished processing the sound of the gas discharge. She had not decided it, I realized. That was the wrong word. She had not decided anything. The bonding had happened before decision was possible. It was reflex. It was architecture. It was the product of 200,000 years of evolution on a world where the thing standing next to you might be the only thing standing between you and death. And the species that bonded fastest and most completely was the species that survived. Fenor was staring at her. His biometric data showed the flat, dormant phase baseline of a Drothkari between cycles. He was neurochemically incapable of generating a bonding response outside his 72-hour window. He could not feel what she had just done for him in the way that she had done it. But he could see it. He had watched a near stranger throw herself between him and a perceived threat without hesitation, without calculation, without any biological reason to care whether he lived or died. And even through the chemical silence of his dormancy, something in him recognized that what he had just witnessed was significant in a way that his models of the universe did not account for. I turned to the monitoring station and checked the board observers' feeds. All 3 were active. All 3 had been watching the biometric data in real time. I pulled up the log of their communication channel and found it empty. They had stopped talking. They had seen the data. They had watched the spike and the behavioral response, and the impossible speed of a bonding event that should not have been possible outside a reproductive window because reproductive windows were supposed to be the only time bonding events occurred. They had nothing to say because the data had said everything. The event concluded 30 minutes later. Participants filed out, chatting, exchanging contact frequencies, making plans to meet again. The humans did this naturally, effortlessly, as if maintaining and extending social connections was as automatic as breathing. Several of the alien participants accepted contact exchanges with expressions of mild bewilderment, as though they had been caught in a current they had not expected and were not sure how to swim against. I found Lieutenant Vasquez in the corridor outside the Commons. She was leaning against the wall, checking something on her personal communicator, looking entirely relaxed. I approached her with my datapad and asked the question that I knew would define my thesis. Lieutenant Vasquez, during the gas discharge incident, you physically shielded Fenor from the perceived threat. You had known him for less than an hour. He is not a member of your species, your unit, or your social group. You had no obligation to protect him. Why did you do it? She looked at me with an expression that told me she genuinely did not understand why I was asking. He was next to me, she said. That's all? That's all it takes. She nodded at me, pocketed her communicator, and walked away down the corridor. I watched her go, and I felt something reorganize in my understanding of the galaxy. Not a small thing, not an adjustment to a model or a revision of an assumption. A fundamental shift in the architecture of how I understood intelligent life. The galaxy had spent 12 years being cautious about humanity. 12 years of careful integration, diplomatic protocols, trade negotiations, and the slow, measured process of fitting a new species into the existing framework of interstellar civilization. The galaxy had been watching humanity for 12 years, and it had been watching for the wrong things. It had been watching for strength, for aggression, for the biological advantages that came from evolving on a death world. It had been cataloging human durability, human adaptability, human endurance, human stubbornness, and filing it all under the heading of potential threat. It had missed the real thing entirely. Humans did not survive their death world because they were strong or fast or clever, although they were all of those things. They survived because the bonding engine never turned off. Because every human being carried inside them a live, armed, permanent capacity to look at the creature standing next to them and decide in less than a second that this creature mattered, that this creature was worth protecting, that this creature was now part of the group, the pack, the family, the unit, the tribe, the circle of things that the human would fight for and bleed for and die for if necessary. They did not do this during a season. They did not do this during a window. They did it all the time, every day, with everyone. The connection was always available, always armed, always ready to fire, and it fired at the speed of reflex for any being that happened to be standing close enough when danger arrived. I returned to my quarters and opened my thesis draft. I read it from beginning to end. Then I deleted every word of it and started over from a blank page. The old title had been clinical, measured, safe, reproductive chronobiology of Homo sapiens, a comparative analysis. It was the title of a paper that fit neatly into existing frameworks and challenged nothing. I typed a new title. I stared at it for a long time. The species that never stops bonding, how year-round reproductive biology created the galaxy's most dangerous allies. Then, I began to write. The emergency alert came through at 3 in the morning, station time, and it changed everything I thought I understood about the limits of human bonding. I was in my quarters, asleep, when the Collegium's Priority 1 alarm tore through the silence like a blade through fabric. I sat up, heart hammering, scales flattened against my skin in the involuntary threat response that every Selvari shares. The alarm meant danger. Not a drill, not a test. Something was wrong on a level that required every conscious being on the station to be aware of it. The details came through on my personal communicator within 30 seconds. A Venari research vessel, the Solace of Rin, had suffered a catastrophic drive failure in the outer approach corridor, approximately 40 minutes from the Collegium at emergency transit speed. 61 crew aboard. The ship's primary power grid had collapsed, taking life support, navigation, and communication with it. They were running on backup batteries that would sustain breathable atmosphere for approximately 60 minutes, after which the carbon dioxide levels would begin rising past survivable thresholds. The Collegium's dedicated rescue teams were deployed to the opposite side of the orbital ring, handling a cargo transport collision that had occurred 4 hours earlier. Redeployment time, 90 minutes minimum. The Venari had 60 minutes. The rescue teams needed 90. The math was simple and fatal. I was still processing this when my communicator lit up with a secondary alert, an informal channel used by the Collegium's academic staff for coordination during emergencies. I opened it and saw a message from Professor Hale, posted 11 seconds after the Priority 1 alert. It read, "All hands, Maintenance Bay 6, now." I got dressed and ran. By the time I reached Maintenance Bay 6, 3 minutes and 40 seconds after the alert, the humans were already there. All of them. Every single human being on the Collegium, 14 people total, had converged on the maintenance bay in under 4 minutes without orders, without authorization, without any directive from station command, or any chain of command whatsoever. Lieutenant Vasquez was running a pre-flight check on a maintenance shuttle that was designed for short-range repair work, not rescue operations. Hale was at a communications terminal, establishing a relay link to the Venari ship. 3 human students were pulling emergency medical kits from storage lockers and loading them onto the shuttle without being told. 2 more were calculating approach vectors on a portable navigation unit. A human engineering student named Owen was elbow-deep in the shuttle's secondary thruster housing, rerouting power from a non-essential system to boost the vehicle's maximum speed. Nobody was in charge, or rather, everyone was in charge of whatever they could see that needed doing, and they were doing it with a coordination that should have required a command structure, but somehow did not. I pulled up the biometric monitoring feeds on my datapad. I still had access from the exchange study, and several of the human participants were wearing their bands. The data stopped me cold. Every human on the station was showing the same hormonal profile: elevated oxytocin, cortisol-managed adrenaline, dopamine-driven focus, serotonin patterns consistent with group cohesion under threat. They had collectively entered a combat bonding state, a neurochemical configuration that in every other species was reserved exclusively for defending mates and offspring during a reproductive window. They were generating that response for 61 Venari they had never met. I pushed through the controlled chaos to Vasquez, who was strapping into the shuttle's pilot seat. "Lieutenant, I have xenobiological medical training. I can help with triage." She looked at me for 1 second. Her eyes were sharp, focused, running some calculation I could not follow. "Good enough," she said. "You're on triage. Grab a medkit and strap in." She did not ask for credentials. She did not verify my qualifications. She did not check with any authority or fill out any documentation. I was a warm body that had volunteered, and she had folded me into her team in under 2 seconds. The same way Hale had folded me into his office that first morning. The same way humans folded everyone into everything, constantly, reflexively, because the bonding engine recognized no boundaries except the ones they chose to impose, and they almost never chose to impose any. The shuttle launched 4 minutes later. 11 people aboard, including myself. 3 trained pilots among them. 1 actual military officer. The rest were students, academics, and 1 xenobiologist who was beginning to suspect that her thesis was going to be less about reproductive biology and more about the most aggressive form of empathy the galaxy had ever produced. The flight took 31 minutes. During that time, Professor Hale maintained a continuous communication link with the Venari ship from the Collegium. I listened through the shuttle's relay as he talked to the Venari crew, and what I heard was a masterclass in human bonding under pressure. The Venari first officer, a woman named Thallon, was on the edge of panic. Her voice was brittle, her breathing rapid, her words coming in fragments that suggested she was having difficulty maintaining focus under the mounting stress of watching her ship die around her. Hale did not tell her to calm down. He did not give her instructions in a commanding tone. He asked her what her favorite food was. It took Thallon 3 seconds to process the absurdity of the question. Then she answered, confused, that she had always enjoyed a particular grain preparation from her homeworld's southern continent. Hale asked her to describe how it was made. Thallon, operating on a kind of autopilot that crisis sometimes creates, began describing the recipe. Her breathing slowed, her voice steadied. Hale asked follow-up questions. He expressed genuine interest. He made a comment about a human dish that used a similar technique, and Thallon almost laughed. He had bonded with her, through a communication relay. During a crisis, in under 30 seconds, He had reached through the static, and the distance, and the fear, and found the single thread that connected two beings from different worlds who had never met. And he had pulled on it with the precise, instinctive skill of a species that had been doing this for 200,000 years without ever stopping to think about it. We reached the solace of Rin with 22 minutes of breathable atmosphere remaining. The ship was in worse condition than the initial reports had suggested. 3 compartments had lost pressure entirely. The hull was showing structural buckling along the dorsal spine. Emergency lighting cast the corridors in a sickly amber glow that made everything look like it was already halfway to being a memory. The 61 crew members were huddled in the remaining pressurized sections, clustered together in the instinctive grouping behavior that most species default to when the walls start closing in. The humans moved through the ship like something I had never seen before and did not have a word for. Not military precision, something messier, something more alive. They argued, they improvised, they shouted corrections to each other and changed plans mid-stride and made mistakes and caught each other's mistakes and adapted in real time with a fluid, chaotic efficiency that should not have worked but did. Owen, the engineering student, reached the ship's backup power grid and stared at it for approximately 15 seconds. Then he began rerouting systems using a technique that he later admitted was half remembered from a lecture he had attended 3 months ago and half invented on the spot. He cross-wired the atmospheric recycler to the emergency lighting circuit, stealing power from a system they did not need, to feed a system that was keeping 61 people alive. It was ugly. It was improvised. It bought them another 18 minutes. A human medical student named Grace set up a triage station in the ship's main corridor and began assessing Venari crew members for hypoxia symptoms with a calm, steady competence that drew frightened people toward her like a gravity well. She did not speak Venari. She worked through a translation device strapped to her wrist and supplemented it with touch, eye contact, and a tone of voice that communicated safety across every species barrier I had ever encountered. Crew members who had been on the edge of panic sat down in front of her and breathed. Vasquez led the evacuation, moving through the failing ship with a systematic intensity that cleared compartment after compartment. She carried a Venari child who had been separated from her parents in the initial chaos, holding the girl against her chest with one arm and directing evacuation routes with the other. The child clung to her uniform with both hands and did not cry. Something in the way Vasquez held her, something in the steady rhythm of the human heartbeat pressed against the child's small body, had communicated a message that transcended language and species and every biological difference between them. You are safe. I have you. I am not going to let go. The Venari captain was the last one off the ship. Her name was Soltherin, and she was old by Venari standards, her carapace scarred by decades of service, her eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who has spent a long career being responsible for other people's lives. Vasquez found her in the command center, running final system checks on a ship that was already dead, performing the rituals of a captain who was not willing to leave until every member of her crew was accounted for. Vasquez pulled her through the airlock with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the urgency of the moment. As Soltherin stepped onto the shuttle, she turned to Vasquez and asked the question. Why? Vasquez tilted her head. Why did you come? You are not military rescue. You are not certified for emergency response. Your species has no treaty obligation to the Venari Compact. You have no reason to risk your lives for us. Vasquez opened her mouth, and I could see in her face that she was searching for the answer, not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple she had never needed to articulate it before. I stepped forward. I had been watching. I had been recording. I had been understanding. They heard you were in danger, I said. For humans, that is the only trigger they need. Soltherin looked at me, then at Vasquez, then at the shuttle full of humans who had come out of their beds at 3 in the morning and flown an under-equipped maintenance vehicle to a dying ship for 61 strangers, and her expression shifted into something I recognized from my own face in the mirror after my first conversation with Professor Hale. The expression of someone whose model of the universe has just been proven insufficient. The shuttle docked at the Collegium 40 minutes later. The Venari crew was processed through medical. All 61 survived. The station's official rescue teams arrived 19 minutes after that, by which time there was nothing left to rescue because a handful of academics and students had already done it. That night, alone in my quarters with the data from the entire event laid out across my screen, I made the discovery that would become the centerpiece of my thesis. I had assumed that the humans' bonding hormones would spike when they reached the Venari ship, when they saw the damage, the frightened crew, the dying systems, when the reality of the crisis became tangible and immediate and personal. That was not what the data showed. The bonding response had spiked when they heard the distress call. Before they knew who was in danger, before they knew the species, before they knew the number of crew, or the severity of the situation, or the odds of success. The moment the alarm sounded, and the words distress and crew and danger entered their awareness, every human on the station had undergone a neurochemical bonding event that committed them to action before their conscious minds had finished processing the information. Humans did not decide to care and then act. They cared first, automatically, chemically, unconditionally, and then they built the action around the caring. The bond preceded the decision. The empathy preceded the plan. The willingness to die for a stranger preceded the knowledge of who the stranger was. I sat in the dark and stared at the data, and I understood, finally, what I was looking at. This was not reproductive biology. This was not a mating strategy. This was not an evolutionary adaptation designed for species propagation. This was something that had started as a reproductive advantage on a death world, and had grown, over 200,000 years of constant operation, into something far larger and far more terrifying than any mating season could ever be. Humans had taken their year-round bonding capability and extended it beyond reproduction, beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond species. They had turned it into a universal operating system for connection. They bonded with their children. They bonded with their friends. They bonded with their colleagues, their pets, their rivals, their enemies, their tools, their ships, their songs, and their stories. They bonded with aliens they had known for 45 minutes, and aliens they had never met and would never meet. They bonded with the idea of someone in danger, with the concept of suffering, with the abstract possibility that somewhere in the dark, someone might need help. I deleted my thesis title again. I typed a new one. The Species That Never Stops Bonding: How Year-Round Reproductive Biology Created the Galaxy's Most Dangerous Allies. Then I stared at it and realized it was still not big enough. But it would have to do. The Xenobiology Review Board reconvened on a morning when the Collegium's observation windows faced the slow, burning arc of the nearest star, and the light that filled the chamber was gold and heavy and felt like something watching. The chamber was standing room only. Word had spread, not just through the academic departments, but through the diplomatic channels and the military liaison offices and the informal networks that connected every species on the station to every other species, through gossip and curiosity, and the universal need to understand something that did not fit the existing models. 3 Galactic Council ambassadors had requested observer status. 2 xenopsychology departments from rival institutions had filed co-publication interest notices. A delegation from the Venari Compact had arrived that morning, unannounced, and was seated in the 3rd row. Professor Hale was sitting in the back of the chamber, arms crossed, legs stretched out in front of him, in the posture of a man who was either completely relaxed or completely certain about what was going to happen next. I had learned, over the weeks of working with him, that with humans, these two states were often the same thing. I stepped to the podium. I placed my hands flat on its surface. I looked out at the assembled faces of 9 species and I began. 12 weeks ago, I sat in this Collegium's lecture hall 17 and learned that human males do not have a mating season. I have spent every day since then trying to understand what that means, and I am here to tell you that the answer is larger than I expected, larger than this board expected, and larger than the Galactic Council's current classification framework is equipped to contain. I brought up the first data display, the flat hormonal profile of the human male, the chart that had started everything. This is the testosterone baseline of an adult human male across a standard orbital year. There is no seasonal spike. There is no fertility window. There is no dormancy period. Human males produce reproductive cells continuously, from approximately age 12 until biological death. This is not a translation error. This is not cultural contamination. This is verified, replicated, biometrically confirmed biological fact. I advance to the female cycle data. Human females operate on a monthly fertility cycle, approximately 12 windows per year. During these windows, they do not enter a reduced function state. They continue all normal activities without significant impairment. A human female in her reproductive years has more fertility opportunities in a single year than most species in this chamber have in a lifetime. I could feel the chamber shifting. Not the physical space, but the attention in it. The collective weight of 200 minds pressing forward against a wall they could feel, but had not yet seen. But the reproductive biology is not the finding. The reproductive biology is the mechanism. The finding is what it created. I brought up the next display, the biometric data from the Cultural Exchange Observation Study. 2 sets of lines. The alien participants, flat and dormant, and exactly as predicted. The humans, blazing with activity. This is a comparison of bonding hormone output during a casual social gathering. The alien participants were in their species' dormancy periods. Their data reflects standard dormant phase socialization, pleasant, cooperative, and hormonally inactive. The human participants were not in any special state. They were in a Tuesday afternoon mixer, and their neurochemistry was fully, continuously, actively engaged in social bonding with every person in the room. I let the data sit for a moment. Then I brought up the incident. At 1 hour and 47 minutes into the event, a minor equipment malfunction discharged harmless gas into the room. In the 3 seconds of uncertainty that followed, Lieutenant Mira Vasquez of Earth's Diplomatic Corps physically shielded a Drothkari student she had known for 45 minutes. Her biometric data shows a protective bonding surge that exceeded any comparable event in my database. She did not decide to protect him. The bonding response preceded conscious decision-making by a measurable interval. Her biology committed to his protection before her mind had finished identifying the threat. I paused. I looked at the Drothkari delegation in the 4th row. Fenor was there. He was watching me with an expression I could not read. When I asked Lieutenant Vasquez why she did it, she said, "He was next to me. That is all it takes." The chamber was silent in the way that only a room full of scientists could be silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of hypothesis formation. I could feel them building models, testing frameworks, trying to fit what I was telling them into structures that could hold it. 2 weeks after the exchange study, a Venari research vessel suffered a catastrophic drive failure in the outer approach corridor. 61 crew, life support failing, rescue teams 90 minutes away. The crew had 60 minutes. I brought up the rescue data. 14 humans aboard this station mobilized in under 4 minutes. Without orders, without authorization, without any chain of command. They commandeered a maintenance shuttle, flew it to a dying ship, and evacuated 61 Venari crew members using improvised techniques, borrowed equipment, and a level of coordinated urgency that should have required weeks of training to produce. All 61 Venari survived. I advanced to the critical data point, the one that had kept me awake for 3 nights. The humans' bonding hormone response did not spike when they reached the Venari ship. It did not spike when they saw the damage or the frightened crew. It spiked when they heard the distress call, before they knew who was in danger, before they knew the species, before they knew the odds. The bonding response preceded every rational calculation. They committed to the rescue before they knew what the rescue would require. I let that settle. Then I stepped out from behind the podium, because what I was about to say was not the kind of thing you said from behind a barrier. The Galactic Council classifies species according to a standard biological framework that assumes reproductive behavior and social bonding are seasonal, cyclical, and finite. Every model we use, every framework we teach, every assumption we build our understanding of sapient life upon, rests on the premise that bonding is a resource that is produced in limited quantities during specific windows, and then depleted. Humans break this framework. They do not bond in seasons. They do not bond in cycles. They bond continuously, universally, and without any biological mechanism for stopping. And this changes everything we think we know about them. I brought up my analysis of human military effectiveness. Consider why human military forces are disproportionately effective despite their recent arrival on the galactic stage. Other species staff their militaries with individuals in biological dormancy, capable, professional, but emotionally disengaged from their unit members outside of reproductive seasons. Human soldiers bond with their units. They form connections with squad members that generate the same protective hormone profiles as family bonds, and these connections do not fade with time. A human squad that has served together for 6 months shows deeper protective bonding chemistry than a Drothkari mated pair at the peak of their reproductive cycle. And unlike the Drothkari, the humans sustain it indefinitely. The bond compounds. A human veteran who served with someone 20 years ago will still respond to that person's distress call with a full bonding hormone surge. The connection does not deactivate. It does not expire. It does not reset. I turn to diplomacy. Consider why human diplomats achieve results that have eluded other species for centuries. Most galactic diplomats operate on rational transactional models. Their biology does not provide social bonding incentives outside their own species during dormant periods. Human diplomats genuinely bond with their counterparts. They remember names. They ask about families. They bring gifts calibrated to personal preferences. They do this because their bonding chemistry fires for everyone, all the time, regardless of species or context. They are not performing warmth as a strategic tactic. The warmth is real. The hormones are real. The connection is real. And every species they negotiate with can sense the difference between genuine engagement and diplomatic theater. A murmur moved through the chamber. I heard it, but did not pause for it. Consider human art, human music, human literature. An unbroken cultural output spanning thousands of years, driven by a species that never stops feeling. I have reviewed the musical archives of 412 catalog species. The average species produces between 200 and 3,000 compositions related to bonding, attachment, and emotional connection, almost all of them tied to specific reproductive seasons. Humans have produced millions, millions of songs about love, loss, longing, devotion, heartbreak, reunion, and the infinite variations of what it means to want someone and be wanted. They have been singing about the same emotional experience since before they discovered fire, and they have never run out of things to say, because the feeling never stops. I played a fragment of a human song, old, simple, a voice and an instrument. The words were about distance and longing, and the particular ache of being separated from someone who mattered. The melody filled the chamber for 12 seconds, and I watched 3 board members shift in their seats in ways that their own biology should not have permitted during dormancy. Human emotional expression was not just prolific, it was contagious. It bypassed biological barriers. It resonated with neurological structures that had nothing to do with human reproductive chemistry, because the emotions it conveyed were fundamental enough to reach across species lines and touch something universal. I stopped the music. The silence it left behind was louder than the song. Distinguished members of the board, a question was raised during my preliminary review that I would like to address directly. I looked at the senior Granathi member, Professor Torath, who had been the most vocal critic of my initial submission. The question was, if humans bond so readily and so constantly, how do they function? How do they make rational decisions? How do they wage war? Does constant emotional engagement not make them vulnerable rather than dangerous? Torath met my eyes. He did not nod, but he did not look away, which was his species' version of acknowledgement. The answer is that humans do not choose between bonding and action. They operate on a dual-engine system that is, as far as I can determine, unique in the catalogued galaxy. The bonding drive is always on, but so is a secondary system that channels bonding energy directly into protective aggression. Humans do not just love. They love and they fight for what they love, using the same hormonal infrastructure simultaneously. The protective instinct is not separate from the bonding instinct. They are the same system, expressing 2 faces of the same drive. I brought up the final data comparison. A human who bonds with you will also, without hesitation, without calculation, and without any need for a seasonal trigger, destroy anything that threatens you. This is why human parents are statistically the most dangerous demographic on their planet when their offspring are threatened. This is why human friendships produce lifelong loyalty that survives distance, time, and conflict. This is why a human soldier will sacrifice herself for someone she met 6 months ago, and why a human professor will talk a panicking alien officer through a crisis using a recipe for bread, and why a human lieutenant will shield a stranger with her own body 3 seconds after learning his name. I stepped back to the podium. The bonding engine does not just create connection, it creates ferocity. It creates a species that is simultaneously the most empathetic and the most protective sapient life form the galaxy has ever catalogued. And it does this every day, without pause, without season, without limit. I closed my data displays. I recommend to this board that humanity be reclassified under a new biological category. They do not fit the standard reproductive biology framework. They do not fit the cyclical bond species model. They do not fit any existing classification. I propose a new one. I typed 2 words onto the display behind me. Persistent bond species. The only known member of the category, I said. The chamber held its breath for 4 seconds. Then Professor Torath, the Grennathi who had rejected my first submission as biologically implausible, raised his foreclaw and said, "I move to accept, unanimously." The vote was immediate, 7-4. 0 against. The first unanimous acceptance in 11 years of board history. The chamber broke into a sound that was not quite applause, because half the species present did not applaud, but something more complex, a layered vocalization of recognition that spanned 9 species and meant, roughly, that something true had been said and heard. I stepped down from the podium and walked through the crowd to the back of the chamber, where Professor Hale was still sitting with his arms crossed, and that expression on his face that I had finally learned to read. It was not amusement. It was not patience. It was pride. The quiet, undemonstrative pride of someone who has watched another person become more than they were, and feels a deep, uncomplicated satisfaction in having been present for the transformation. "Thank you," I said. He shook his head. "I didn't do much." "That is exactly the point. You did not perform. You did not put on a demonstration. You showed up, every day, and you were yourself. A human being, running constantly with bonds and connections and care that never switched off. And that was enough to rewrite a thesis, and possibly reshape how the galaxy classifies your species." He smiled. It was the same kind of smile I had seen on that human male student in the Commons weeks ago, the one talking to the female over a table in the middle of a standard academic cycle, with no season, and no trigger, and no reason, except that he wanted to be near her. A smile that came from somewhere deep and permanent and unregulated by any biological clock. "Are you going to miss the collegium when you graduate?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I started to formulate a response based on professional development trajectories and career planning models, and then I stopped, because that was not what he was asking, and I knew it. I was going to miss it. I was going to miss this station and these corridors, and the sound of 9 languages layered over each other in the Commons during meal hours. I was going to miss the way Fenor nodded at me in the hallways now, a small gesture that carried the weight of a shared experience that neither of us had expected. I was going to miss Lieutenant Vasquez and her absurd, beautiful certainty that the person standing next to her was always, automatically, worth protecting. I was going to miss Hale, his dry humor and his patience, and his battered leather bag, and his override drink, and the way he waited for people to understand things at their own speed, and never rushed them. I had bonded, not in the Selvari way, not through seasonal chemistry or hormonal mandate, something looser, something warmer, something that had been growing in the background of every conversation and every data point, and every hour I had spent trying to understand a species that never stopped connecting, and had, without my realizing it, connected with me. "Yes," I said, "I am going to miss it." He nodded, and his smile deepened in a way that told me he already knew. Humans always already knew. They were calibrated for exactly this kind of moment. That night, I sat in my quarters and opened my research journal to the last page. The page I had reserved for the final entry, the one that would close the appendix of my thesis and end the longest, strangest, most important research project of my life. I had come to the Galactic Collegium of Interspecies Sciences to study a species without a mating season. I had expected to find a biological anomaly, a quirk of evolutionary pressure, a footnote in the vast encyclopedia of galactic life that would earn me a degree and a quiet academic career. Instead, I had found a species without an off switch. Humans did not cycle. They did not peak and fade. They did not open windows and close them. They burned, constantly, in every direction, for everyone they had ever let into their orbit. They burned for their families and their friends, and their colleagues, and their pets and their rivals, and the stranger standing next to them, and the voice on the other end of a distress call, and the alien sitting in their office at 6 in the morning, with 147 questions and trembling hands. The galaxy had spent 12 years being nervous about what humans could do, their strength, their adaptability, their stubbornness, their death world durability. It should start paying attention to what humans could feel. Because a species that never stops bonding is a species that will never stop fighting for the things it loves. And humans, I had learned, loved very easily. They loved quickly and deeply and without reservation, and they did not require a season, or a window, or a hormonal mandate to begin. They only required proximity and time, and the faintest reason to care, and then the engine caught, and it burned, and it did not stop. I signed my name at the bottom of the entry. I closed the journal. I set it on my desk and looked out the window at the stars and the slow, turning vastness of the galaxy that was going to have to make room in its understanding for a species that could not stop reaching out, could not stop holding on, could not stop caring, and would never, ever learn to let go. Then I stood up and went to find Hale and ask if he wanted to get dinner, because that, I now understood, was the most human thing I could possibly do.